But anyway, we'll go through it. This is not an easy, this is one of the harder arguments, but frankly, I think Descartes' version of this argument, at least to me, seems a little easier to follow than Anselm's version. And by the way, remember again, if you print this out in outline form, you can get all the information on these slides in about 2 or 3 pages. So again, it's called the ontological argument because ontos means being in Greek or existence. And so the ontological argument in both of the forms is a priori. It doesn't rely on any observations about the world, but it relies just on the concept of God, of God's being, of who God is. So both claim that we can move from the concept of God to a claim that the being who fits the concept must necessarily exist. And we looked at St. Anselm and saw that he works with the concept of God as the greatest being we can think of or imagine. God is that than which none greater can be thought, to quote Anselm. Descartes works with a concept of God as the supremely perfect being, as the being who has all perfections, all perfect qualities. And we'll see he's going to try to make existence one of those perfect qualities. Now, I think personally what Descartes does is take Anselm's reply to Guanillo. What Guanillo said, and it's been repeated by Alvin Plantinga, among other people, recently, is that the cases are different between something like the most perfect island and something like God. That somehow existence is an integral part of the nature of God in a way that it is not an integral part of the nature of something like the most perfect island, even the most perfect island. Now, whether he can pull off that that distinction, I don't know. I've always been a little unsatisfied with it, and so have a lot of other people. But I think what Descartes does is he takes that insight, that reply to Guanillo, and kind of runs with it and says, well, okay, I'm going to develop an argument for God's existence, a version of the ontological argument that shows very clearly how existence is an integral part of God's nature and how it can't be separated from God's nature. So how does this occur? Well, remember Descartes, the inventor of analytic geometry, which you may or may not have sat through in high school. I did at Polytechnic, but not everybody goes that far in their high school math. Descartes is no slouch. He is a mathematician as well as a philosopher. And he says, there's something about the nature, the essential nature of something like a triangle, where qualities that are essential to a triangle's being what it is cannot be separated from the concept of what a triangle is. In other words, and this goes back to Aristotle, that there are essential properties of something, properties that are bound up with a thing's essential nature, but also properties. Remember, he thought the essential nature of human beings is to be rational beings. the essential nature of a knife is to cut, bound up with the essential nature of a triangle is that it have three angles that add up to 180 degrees and three sides. It is not a part of the essential nature of a triangle that it be colored with any particular color, right? This can be a triangle, and it doesn't matter whether it's a red triangle or a yellow one or a black one. Those aren't essential to its being a triangle, but having three angles is. And so what Descartes is going to claim is that just as it's essential to the nature of a triangle to have three angles, so it's essential to the nature of God to have existence, or necessary existence. So existence then cannot be separated from the essence of God any more than having three angles equal to two right angles can be separated from the essence or the essential nature of a triangle, right? You can't, you say, I can say, well, okay, I want you to think of a triangle for me, but in this case, I want you to think of one that doesn't have three angles. I say, wait a second, I can't do that. You can't think of a triangle unless you think of it as having three angles. It's not a triangle if it doesn't have three angles. Right, and so Descartes is going to try to say, yeah, and you also can't think of God except as thinking of God as a necessary being. So we can't even think of God then except as existing or necessarily existing, just as we can't think of a triangle without thinking of it as having three angles equal to 180 degrees. So why then is existence such an essential part of God's nature, according to Descartes' version? Well, this is bound up with his claim that God is the supremely perfect being. The way it was said in the 20th century is that God is the sum of all perfections. That God as the supremely perfect being possesses all perfect qualities. The sum of all perfections or all perfect qualities. Existence being one of those perfections. Okay? So why is existence inseparable from God's essence? Because God is the supremely perfect being, and as the supremely perfect being, God has all perfections, including existence. Now, I came across a philosophy text recently that portrays Descartes' argument like this, and I've been doing this for 20 years, and I'm thinking maybe I should have copyrighted this or something. But at any rate, suppose we had two competing descriptions of God. And your claim is that one of these descriptions is the description of God as the supremely perfect being, right? And here we're talking about God as God is normally portrayed in the monotheistic religions, not only Christianity, but I think Judaism and Islam has the same conception of God as possessing okay, I want to take that away for a second. As possessing the normal attributes that God is thought to have, right? God is omnipotent. That is, God is all-powerful. God is omniscient. God is all-knowing. God knows everything. God is omnipresent. God is everywhere. It's not that God gets around so fast in the universe, but that the universe is in God. Omnibenevolence, God is merciful and morally perfect and just. And if Descartes looked at this list, he'd say, well, you know what? That's good as far as it goes, but that's not a description of the God that possesses all perfections, all perfect qualities. Besides those traditional attributes, what you need to do is you need to add one more quality to the list. You need to add existence, because that's a perfection of God. And, of course, what happens when you do that? Well, imagine Descartes saying to the fool, remember, the fool is the person who denies God's existence. It goes back to that quote that Anselm did from the Psalms. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God, right? So you can imagine Descartes coming to somebody who denies God's existence and says, well, you know, I know you don't think God is around. I know you don't believe that God exists, but would you give me this? Would you at least give me the assumption that if God were around, God would certainly be the most perfect being, that God would be the being that would possess all perfections if God were there? And so maybe the non-believer says, well, all right, I'll grant you that God is the most perfect being if God would be around. Well, Descartes would say, but wait a second. In agreeing that God is the most perfect being, you've just agreed that God exists. Because existence is one of the perfections that God has. So you can't agree with me that God's the most perfect being without also agreeing that God exists. So, in other words, it would be a contradiction to, on the one hand, agree on the concept of God as the most perfect being, and on the other hand, deny God's existence because existence is one of those perfect attributes that God has. So you see how this argument works. If you buy into the premise and into the description of God, and existence is part of that description, then you bought into God's existence in just agreeing to the concept of God as the most perfect being, the supremely perfect being. So, again, so completely does God, the supremely perfect being, exist that God cannot even be thought of as not existing. Right? Because existence is part of the description of God. So it's as hard, Descartes would claim, to think of God as not existing as it would be to think of a triangle as not having three angles. It's impossible. So the conclusion, of course, is that God exists. So here's a simple summary of this argument from a text I used to use. God has all perfections. Existence is a perfection or a perfect quality. Therefore, God has existence, or God exists. Very simple little argument, airtight logically. So you can say, well, what can possibly be wrong with it? Well, Immanuel Kant was a believer in God. I like to say that Kant shot down every other argument for God's existence in order to get out his own. He's in the German Lutheran tradition. Kant's own argument for God, he says, does not prove God, but it shows that we're justified rationally in positing that God ought to be there. Why? Well, Kant says, look around you at this world. We have within us this sort of idea that justice ought to be done in this world. But we know it's not done in this world. We know the righteous are not always rewarded. Sometimes they suffer. Look at some of these righteous healthcare workers that have come down with this horrible disease. We know that, on the other hand, evil is not always punished. Sometimes evil people live very comfortably. So you can say justice is not done in this life. So in order for morality to make any sense, Kant says we're rationally justified in thinking that there ought to be an afterlife where justice will be done. And we're also rationally justified in thinking that probably there's a God in that afterlife who's going to see to it that that's the case, that the righteous are rewarded in the end and that evil is taken care of. And so we're justified rationally. It's not an irrational thing to think that there's an afterlife and that God is there. For Kant, okay? But he does not think an argument like the ontological argument that claims to prove God with mathematical certainty, the certainty of a proof in geometry, really does the job. And why not? Well, it all goes to how Descartes treats existence. Now, I guess basically, if we say X is, this is a board and it isn't a board. X is P, like we say, this board is black, this board is rectangular, like X is rectangular. Well, this P is what we call in logic a logical predicate. It's a much narrower meaning than predicate as you've been taught in English, the subject predicate form of a sentence. A logical predicate is a predicate in the English sense, but it's a much more narrower meaning. In other words, when we predicate a property of something in logic, we say that something has a particular property or characteristic. That's what's called a logical predicate. And when it comes to God, right, we're saying X, or in this case, God, is we're predicating properties like God is omniscient, God is all-knowing. Well, for Descartes, existence is one of those properties. God is an existing being, or God exists. God has existence. And Immanuel Kant would say, well, what do you add to the concept of a thing? What do you add to the description of a thing to say that it exists? He says, you don't. I mean, suppose I describe my car and it doesn't look like that. Right. I once, believe it or not, I mean, you'd say, come on, you didn't really do that. I was stuck in construction on I-66 when I was commuting up to see my dad and take my mother to visit him. He was in a nursing home at the time. And at that time, back in the 80s, I had a CB in the car. I also had a ham radio, but sometimes the CB was more useful. Where I happened to get into a conversation, because we were both stuck in traffic, with Paul Stanley of KISS, because he and Ace Frehley, they both lived down in Charlottesville. And so we were talking, you know, and he was saying, yeah, I'm going to New York. I got a DeLorean up there, you know, which is like this, you know. And I guess if you're Paul Stanley of KISS, you can afford a DeLorean and to have it also up there in New York. But, I mean, if I describe my car, you know, well, it's a 2005 Chevy Aveo. It's blue, has a 4-cylinder engine. It exists. It has an automatic transmission. And you say, wait a second, back up there, Professor Murawski. It's blue, it exists, and it has an automatic transmission. What does saying it exists add to the description? You know, in other words, it seems odd that I would describe my car and put the fact that it exists along with saying that it's blue and it has an automatic transmission. And this is Kant's point, that that's not how existence functions. He says existence is not a logical predicate, but it's a precondition of a thing's having any predicates applicable to it, having any qualities that we can predicate of it. In other words, my car has to first exist in order to be blue, have an automatic transmission, have 4 doors, or any other quality it has, right? But existence is not one of the properties of my car. It's a condition it has to fulfill to have any properties. And so what Kant says is this is important, that existence is not just another quality in the description of a thing along with its being red or having a particular type of engine. So we describe a thing with all of its qualities and afterwards talk about whether it exists or not. Well, if that's the case and existence is no longer a property in the list of God's qualities, then it means that you don't run into a contradiction in denying God's existence. And this is where Kant goes with it. He says, when we deny existence to something, we reject the thing with all of its qualities. In other words, if I say, well, there's no red sports car pictured in this slide, I reject it with all of the qualities it had, being red and having the particular shape it had, the particular type of wheels, da-da-da-da-da-da, right? And similarly, go back to Descartes' point about the triangle. Kant says, well, yeah, you know what, Descartes, you're right. I can't think of a triangle unless I think of it as having 3 angles. But you know what? If I deny the existence of a triangle, I reject it with all of its properties, including the 3 angles. Right? There's no contradiction in my saying there's no triangle on this slide. I've rejected it with all of its properties. And so if you take existence out of the list of God's qualities, then it becomes possible to deny God's existence without running into contradictions. And the ontological argument in Descartes' version no longer works. You no longer run into contradictions assuming God's non-existence. And so this is basically Kant's point. Now remember, Kant believes in God, but he thinks that you don't run into contradictions to deny God's existence. Yeah? Well, I mean, right. Well, in a way, that's the purpose of some of these arguments is that they understand that if God is around and God has the traditional attributes, God is not visible to our senses. And so the idea is, can you argue from something that you can see, like the order in the universe, like the fact that things have causes, or in this case, from an abstract concept, to the conclusion that something that's beyond our experience must nonetheless be there. See, that's the whole point of these arguments. They recognize exactly the point you're making, that that if God's around, God's generally thought of as being a being that we don't, that's beyond the range of any of our senses. So the thought is, can we provide a logical argument that proves something that is beyond the realm of our senses? And you correctly raise the question as whether or not that can be done. I mean, it's controversial in philosophy as to whether or not we can, using rational arguments, prove a conclusion that refers to something totally beyond our experience. So that's a very legitimate point to raise here. And you're right, there's a difference between triangles. Now, of course, here again, if you're talking about Plato's triangle, we didn't go into the forms, but he thinks there's an eternal triangle that's like the blueprint for all triangles in an unseen realm, and it's eternal, it's unseen, it never changes, and it sets the standard for every single triangle. He calls these forms, and it's hard to argue that they're there too, So yeah, but do you see why this is a criticism of Descartes' version? If you don't run into contradictions denying the existence of God, then the ontological argument doesn't work. That's the characteristic of an airtight mathematical or logical, deductive logical argument. You cannot agree that the premises are true and reject the conclusion in a deductive argument without running into contradictions. But if Kant has shown that you can agree that the premises are true, that God has all perfect qualities, but you take existence out of that list, so you can deny the conclusion that God exists without running into contradictions if you take God out of the list. I mean, if you take existence out of the list of God's perfect qualities. And so Kant did that, and he has what for years was thought to be the argument that kind of does the ontological argument in, or at least that is the biggest hurdle that Descartes' version. So we can describe God with all God's qualities, then only afterwards talk about whether God, as the being we describe, exists or not, and no contradiction arises in denying existence to God if existence is no longer a quality in God's description. In other words, if you can buy into the concept that God might possess all perfect qualities if God exists, but existence is not one of those qualities, then you can say, well, yeah, I agree that if God existed, he would possess all perfect qualities, but I don't think God is there, without contradicting yourself. What gave rise to the contradiction was that existence was in the list of God's qualities. It was a quality that we could predicate of God, along with being omnipotent and omniscient. But if you take that out of the list, then you don't run into contradictions, and the ontological argument doesn't work. Now, what gave new life to this argument well, Alvin Plantinga is the most famous person to have gotten out a version of the argument that avoids Kant's criticisms. And the argument itself is a kind of high-powered logical argument. But what I've done on the blackboard is give you a very simplified version of the 20th century form of this argument. And in ordinary logic, you can talk about whether a statement is true or false. You can talk about whether something exists or does not exist. And contemporary logic treats existence just like Kant thought it ought to be treated. Not as a logical predicate, but outside, of the description of something. You can describe something with all its predicates, then talk about whether it exists or doesn't exist in modern logic. But necessary existence, contingent existence, everything in this room is contingent. There's no necessity to anything. There's nothing in the fabric of the universe that says this table had to exist. There's no necessity. It's a contingent thing. It came into existence at one point. It's going to go out of existence at some point when it finally gets scrapped, right, or recycled. There's necessary existence, and there's impossible existence. In other words, it's impossible that there could ever be such a thing as a square circle, because the very notion of it involves a contradiction. Well, there's an extension of ordinary logic called modal logic. Modalities, possibility, impossibility, necessity, are built into that logic in a way, and they're handled in that extension of ordinary logic in the way that ordinary logic can't deal with, right? And so this new proof for the existence of God is carried out in a system of what is called modal logic, M-O-D-A-L. I'm not going to ask you anything about this, okay? But I just want to give you some kind of an idea of why the debate was reopened on it in the middle of the 20th century. Well, in a system of modal logic, you can express possibility and necessity. And one way of talking about something's being possible and contingent is that there is a possible world in which it exists, and it might be the actual world. One way of talking about impossibility is to say that there's no possible world. Technically, there's no assignment of values to the variables that would make the statement true. There's no possible world in which a square circle exists. But if something has necessary existence, then there's no possible world where it does not exist. Something that has necessary existence exists in all possible worlds. Well, this is the conclusion you would like to get to about God. So the modal argument starts with this premise. You can call it a premise here. It is possible that a necessary being exists. I always have to correct people. Students don't want to put an S there, and here I'm making a freshman's mistake. Okay. Or another way we could say it is possible that there exists at least one necessary being. And of course you want that necessary being to be God, right? Now imagine that Alvin Plantinga talks to somebody who doesn't believe in God. And he says, well, you know what? I know you don't believe in God, but would you grant me this, that it's at least possible that there is a necessary being? In other words, it's at least possible that God exists. You know, I would say, okay, I know you don't believe in the existence of the necessary being we call God, but would you at least grant me that it's at least possible that God exists? And maybe somebody who doesn't believe in God says, well, all right, I'll at least grant you that. I don't think God's there, but I'll grant you that it's possible God exists. But then you kind of got the hook in them, you know, because in modal logic, you can go in about half a dozen steps in a proof that looks like a proof in algebra or geometry to the conclusion that it's necessary that a necessary being exists. So from the assumption that it's merely possible, you can prove that it's necessary. And if it's necessary that a necessary being exists, it means that God has to exist in all possible worlds, in all conceivable situations, that there's no way God cannot exist. So from the mere assumption that it's possible that God exists, you conclude that it's necessary that God exists, that God has to exist. And now the people who have problems with this version of the argument are also people who have problems generally with this whole extension of logic called modal logic. I happen to be one of them. But the actual form of the argument is kind of complicated, and it requires much more logic than you get in even an advanced undergraduate course, right? But at any rate, these are the essentials. And this new version, you can say, well, why were people interested in this version? Because it gets around Kant's criticisms. This version treats existence in the way that modern logic treats existence, which is exactly how Kant said we ought to treat existence. And it does not treat existence as a predicate, so it gets around Descartes' mistake and Kant's criticism of Descartes. You know, so here's a new version of the argument that is not done in by Kant's criticism that we can't treat existence like a logical predicate. This version does not treat existence like a logical predicate, and so it reopened interest in this argument as to whether or not it might work after all. You know, and the debate still goes on, by the way. You know.
Descartes and so they both believe the same thing.
Well, yeah, they both put out versions of the ontological argument. They both believe that you can go from the mere concept of God to proving God's existence. And the ontological argument is not the only a priori argument for God. Descartes has another one. He has two or three more, but we're not going to worry about those. He tries to prove that his idea of God is so perfect that if there has to be as much reality in the cause as there is in the effect, that his idea is so perfect it couldn't have come from nothing, couldn't have come from anybody or anything in this world. He couldn't have generated it because he's a poor, imperfect sinner. The only thing that could have caused his perfect idea of God is God himself. Hence, God must exist as the cause of his perfect idea of God. Now, that's not the ontological argument, but that is an a priori argument because it goes just from the concept of God. But yeah, Anselm and Descartes agree. And Guanillo criticized Anselm, Kant criticized Descartes. yeah, to keep things straight, you know. And then this new version tries to get around Kant's criticism of Descartes by getting out a version of the argument that does not treat existence as a logical predicate. Okay, well, again, these are not easy arguments. I told you I once came back to teaching after being out for about 1.5 to 2 years in 2009, and the first thing I did is I thought, well, I'm going to restructure my intro course, and I'm going to start out with something hard-hitting and interesting and controversial. How about arguments for God? So I put it at the beginning of the course, and I got a lot of rebellion from people saying, man, this is a hard way to start out this course, Professor Murawski. And I learned I didn't make that mistake twice. I don't put these arguments at the beginning of a course. I wait till you have a little philosophy under your belt. But now that you all are experts in philosophy, see, we can throw these arguments at you. You know, but I understand they're complicated, you know. And again, we're just going to ask for mostly the main points on the, you know, test. We're not going to ask you to, you know, redo the argument. You might redo it in an essay, but then you'll have your things to refer to. Go ahead.
What would that be?
I don't know. I got to look and see. I don't have my printout of the syllabus with me because it's listed on the syllabus, and I forget exactly what date it is. I'm sure I picked a date that was different from the one for Essex, but I got to look and see. You know, but it always seems like you no sooner get through test 1, the test 2 is looming on the horizon, you know, as a dark, shadowy figure. So
should we look at the syllabus date?
you look, well, right now you can look at the syllabus date. I gotta look and see if that's what I'm going to do. I don't want to have a conflict with Essex because it's not fair to anybody if I have too many of these to grade in a single week, because then I can't, you know, put enough time into it. You know, you want to have enough time to say, okay, maybe I got to read this again to see what the student was saying, and maybe they really are saying something, but it went past me the first. Yeah, November 3rd. Yeah, that's what I thought. We may keep that, which is it's okay. It's more than a week from today, so I have time to get you a review sheet and stuff.
Will it be the same essay, home?
Yeah, it'll be the same deal. So I'll get you a sheet of possible take-home essay options, you know, and then there'll be 25 questions in here. And again, and I hate to ask you to do this, but, you know, if you haven't already bought 3 Scantrons, go out and splurge for 43 cents at the bookstore again. You know, I wish we could. Pardon? You know, you're right. I didn't. Let me call it real quick. But when I call your name, you're dismissed. You can leave and hold it. Let me just stop. I don't want to get the roll on the recording, so let me just upload this.